Malaysian Prime Minister warns the Philippines about bad Chinese money. Is this the beginning of a new era in the South China Sea? Before Duterte was elected in 2016, China and the Philippines had been in a standoff over territorial disputes in the South China Sea. But Duterte decided to set those disputes aside. Instead, he focused on an ambitious $180 billion project he creatively called Build, Build, Build. But the problem was money, money, money. And that opened the door to Chinese investment. In 2016, Duterte secured $24 billion in investment, credit, and loan pledges from Chinese President Xi Jinping's government to upgrade his country's infrastructure. According to the London-based think tank Capital Economics, corruption problems are a part of Chinese investments, and the Philippines already has a trade imbalance approaching unsustainable levels, meaning it imports way more than it exports. And so, Mahathir told Duterte, you know, countries who take out big Chinese loans, I'm not naming names here, but maybe they should be careful. And the Philippine Finance Secretary says the Philippines will definitely never get caught in a Chinese debt trap. I mean, sure, it happened to Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Montenegro, the Maldives, Djibouti, and a bunch of other countries, but it'll never happen to the Philippines. That's true, if they don't take too much Chinese money. Either way, though, there's another aspect of the Chinese regime's debt trap diplomacy Mahathir also warned about: too many Chinese workers. He said foreign direct investment should not involve bringing huge numbers of foreigners to live in the country because that might disturb the political equations in the country. In other words, these foreigners are taking our jobs! Somehow it sounds so different coming out of the mouth of a 93-year-old doctor. Since Duterte took office in 2016, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese workers have come to the Philippines. The population has basically tripled. Chinese nationals now get more than half the working visas granted by the Philippines, and the majority of special work permits. And a lot of them work in online casinos, which is a very interesting career choice. Plus, a lot of Chinese workers are in the Philippines illegally. Recently, the government has been conducting mass raids. And Mahathir said, if huge numbers of any foreigners come to live and stay in the country, or even to influence the economy, then you have to do some rethinking, whether it is good or bad, or the limits that we have to impose on them. You know, any foreigners, not from any country in particular. But for China, Mahathir threw a major wrench in the communist regime's plan to use debt trap diplomacy in Malaysia. And if he's now becoming a rallying point for other Southeast Asian nations to abandon China's version of so-called win-win cooperation, it might just become a lose-lose scenario for the Chinese Communist Party, which I'm torn about because I don't believe in no-win scenarios. But Mahathir didn't stop at economics. He also called out China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. Trillions of dollars of shipping go through it, along with untapped natural gas and oil deposits. China claims basically all of it. Obviously, that competes with claims by both the Philippines and Malaysia. As I've said, Duterte has mostly backed down, even though the Philippines had the strongest claim after a ruling from The Hague rejected China's claim in favor of theirs. But while Mahathir was in the Philippines, he said China should define its so-called ownership of the South China Sea, while also saying he'd be totally fine with China's claims as long as they basically take no action on them. But somehow I don't imagine the Chinese Communist Party will be too agreeable about owning something without controlling it. They're not great at letting go. Just ask Hong Kong. So, what do you think of Mahathir's message to the Philippines?
China is in the midst of a rapid push to gain economic and political ascendancy across the Asia-Pacific region and the world. And it's splashing out billions of dollars across the globe in concessional loans to developing countries for infrastructure projects. But what happens when countries, often poorer than China, can't pay them back?
Experts warn Beijing is offering up bad loans as a form of entrapment to gain influence and power across the world.
Here's how it works. Poorer nations are lured by China's offer of cheap loans for transformative infrastructure projects. Then, when predictably, these countries are unable to keep up with their repayments, Beijing can demand concessions or other advantages in exchange for debt relief. This is known as debt trap diplomacy. Let's take Sri Lanka for example. Protests erupted last year when Sri Lanka was forced to hand over control of the failed Hambantota port project over to China, after it found itself billions of dollars in debt to Beijing. China now has control of a key port on the doorstep of regional rival India, and a strategic foothold along a key commercial and military waterway. At the same time, a little closer to home, Australia has been sluggish to respond to China's spreading influence in the South Pacific. Chinese loans have gone from 0 to 1.8 billion in a decade. And some of our neighbours are already heavily laden with debt to Beijing. Fiji owes China $500 million, and Tonga now owes more than 160 million. That's a third of its GDP. Tonga's also been forced to admit it may fail to repay its debts. That stoked fears other small Pacific countries could fall into debt distress and possibly become vulnerable to diplomatic pressure from Beijing. Earlier this year, reports that China was moving to create a military base in Vanuatu sparked a panic in Australia. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has now announced the creation of a new infrastructure bank for projects across the region.
At the heart of the issue of Chinese investment is President Xi Jinping's flagship economic policy, the One Belt, One Road initiative.
It's a $1 trillion project aimed at connecting countries across continents for trade with China at its centre. Beijing has characterised the project as a win-win for both its global trade ambitions and for infrastructure-starved developing economies.
The belt connects to land, the road moves on the sea. The promise that they hold is joint prosperity.
But in reality, many vulnerable countries are finding themselves overwhelmed by Chinese debt. The Centre for Global Development highlights 8 countries it says find themselves at risk of being unable to repay their loans. In Montenegro, China loaned the fledgling European state more than $1 billion in 2015 to complete a key highway linking its port of Bar to landlocked Serbia. Now, debt levels are at 80% of GDP. Montenegro faces the prospect of either having to abandon the half-complete project or negotiate for more money from China, pushing it deeper into Beijing's sphere of influence. And in Africa, China is financing major projects across the continent, and Beijing's level of investment is gathering pace. In 2017 alone, the value of Chinese projects in Africa was $105 billion, and the value of Chinese loans to Africa has tripled since 2012. In Zambia, for example, the signs of Chinese investment are everywhere. Schools, surgeries, and construction projects bear Chinese symbols. And a vast new network of roads is being built, all with Chinese finance.
For now, many countries are enjoying the investment injection, new highways, airports, and promises of economic development. But it may only be a matter of time until they too are overwhelmed by debt.
Amid the debates about China's growing influence and fears Beijing wants to expand its strategic military presence across the globe, it's easy to forget they have only a single overseas military base in the African nation of Djibouti. The United States, meanwhile, has an estimated 800 bases across 70 countries.
So while Chinese money may be putting some countries at risk, and Beijing could be wielding its loans as a strategic tool, it's not the only country projecting its power around the world.
Just how deep President Xi Jinping's ambitions run is unclear. But with this now dubbed the Asian Century, there's no doubt he plans on China leading the way, instead of following the pack.